We will post the recordings as soon as they're available. And John Fennell is the facilitator this morning, so let's just turn it over to John.
All right. Well, I have prepared some notes, and it's hard to keep my face on you and look at the notes at the same time, so you'll have to forgive me for not looking you in the eye. Let me begin these remarks with a word of caution. Now, most of you, given your seniority and your very long and thoughtful affiliation with Polanyi, are in no need of this caution. I expect you know very well where Polanyi is leading up to. But for those of you who have not dwelled on what Polanyi terms the abyss of self-doubt, that's on page 23. For those who have not dwelled on that particular concept, I wanted to provide some fair warning. By digging deeply into this lecture, something quite irreversible might well ensue. And it isn't clear that where we end up is someplace that every one of us would like to be. More on that in a few minutes. For now, I want to make a few comparatively innocent remarks. As in all of the prior lectures, much of what we find in this one is familiar. And many of you are better acquainted with the complete corpus of Polanyi than I am, so you will see connections that I failed to see. And many of you, especially Phil and Gus, etc., will see changes in expression, changes in thought that I am insensitive to. But here are a few things that did occur to me, given my background. First, we have here the frog from personal knowledge. That is to say, Polanyi once again notes that we must be able to identify things through non-theoretical cognition before we can theorize about them. And then, of course, it is a person who recognizes the object and then brings theory to bear on it. This is, of course, review, but it's something that's prominent in this lecture. Second in this lecture is something near and dear to me since I wrote a paper on it, is Polanyi's critique of nominalism and his related defense of general ideas and universals. And we find these arguments outlined in the essay Tacit Knowing, Its Bearing on Some Problems in Philosophy from 1962, and also in Sense Giving and Sense Reading in 1967. And also there is a discussion of nominalism and personal knowledge. Now, this discussion of nominalism gives rise to perhaps the first of the questions that you might want to discuss in a few minutes. In this discussion of nominalism, Polanyi in this lecture states, quote, "In speaking of man in general, we are not attending to any particular man, but are relying on our tacit awareness of individual men for attending to their joint meaning," end of quote. My question is, but how do we know these individuals to be men to begin with? Perhaps we'll want to explore that in a minute. Finally, in the final 7 pages of the lecture, we encounter an account of science that's strongly reminiscent of what we see in Science, Faith, and Society. What's interesting is that there is no mention of commitment in a lecture that's titled Commitment to Science. There's no mention of commitment in this lecture until page 20, except for one passing mention of commitment on page 11, which is really not substantive. So this gives rise to an additional pair of questions. Why is the reference to commitment in an essay with that in its title put off for so long? And why, in light of what is said by Polanyi earlier in the lecture, is mention of commitment made at this particular place on page 20, where then, of course, it's mentioned many a time. Now, I'm going to proffer a few preliminary responses to these questions in what follows. Above all, the mere mention of commitment brings to mind chapter 10 of Personal Knowledge, which is titled Commitment. In my view, the opening 2 pages of chapter 10 of Personal Knowledge, and those 2 pages are titled Fundamental Beliefs, represent the very heart of the entire Polanyian enterprise. We have in these 2 pages under the heading Fundamental Beliefs, the confessional articulation of the ingenious and monumental performative consistency that provides the justification that is essential to this or any other claim to meaning. So one would expect to find something like this in the lecture that has commitment in its heading. And interestingly, there was not a clue of that early on, which is one of the things that made me disappointed in the lecture at first. Now, these 2 pages under the heading Fundamental Beliefs in Chapter 10 of Personal Knowledge, I believe that this is Polanyi's vital contribution to what he calls superior knowledge and to the intellectual and moral firmament, the term he uses, the preservation of which is his primary concern. So I hope as we discuss this lecture, we will see some of this playing out here as it did in Personal Knowledge. In any event, these 2 pages at the front of Chapter 10 of Personal Knowledge and the chapter as a whole, I think, must haunt us as we read this 3rd Duke lecture. For these reasons, I want to pose a second pair of questions for our discussion. I mentioned that those 2 pages highlight the performative consistency in Polanyi, which I think is at the heart of his major contribution to thought. The questions I want to raise are, why is consistency of such significance to Polanyi? And what is the justification for making consistency obligatory and apparently the paramount standard? Perhaps we can investigate those later. Now, this lecture refers to a host of philosophers. And to begin with, we have Kant, Brentano, Dilthey, Husserl, and Plato. And I would pose as additional questions for those of you who have the background, are these references to these philosophers accurate and fair? And do they in fact support Polanyi's epistemological project? I myself am little qualified to judge. My background on these people is not as great as it needs to be. Certainly, Polanyi moves very fast on these matters, and I do not understand myself much of what he says. Perhaps you will want to examine some of these statements more closely. For example, Polanyi says, and why does he say this? That Husserl has proved so far the most influential thinker of the 20th century. Now that stunned me. I mean, I've read some Husserl, but I'd never for a moment thought of him as the most influential thinker of the century. So this could be something worth probing. And perhaps this matter would be further clarified if somebody among us were to explain what Polanyi means when he says, I shall show how my theory of knowledge tries to discipline intentionality by its bearing on reality. That's on page 10. What on earth does that mean? And does Polanyi, as we see in Cinderella, does he distort the foot of Heidegger's Dasein to fit the theory of tacit knowing? I don't know. Maybe Charlie can enlighten us on that one. But I believe there are bigger fish to fry in this lecture, much bigger fish. And the matters I am referring to arise in conjunction with Polanyi's citation of Heidegger, Sartre, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard. In connection with his reference to Heidegger and Sartre on page 11 and 12, I'll have to live with that phone for a second, I'm afraid. Polanyi raises a very important question, perhaps the most important that can be raised. Can there be meaning in a world where death is inevitable? Indeed, in a universe where utter obliteration of humanity is evidently guaranteed. It's at this point that Polanyi identifies his central concern. We're looking at page 12. And these are his words. Throughout this inquiry, I shall seek to answer the question on what grounds we can possibly justify a choice of existence. That's really strange syntax. Let me read it again. Throughout this inquiry, I shall seek to answer the question, on what grounds can we possibly justify a choice of existence? While Polanyi voices his objections to existentialism, and it is inappropriate to rank him under that heading, he does acknowledge the legitimacy of its fundamental challenge of what value is existence? On what grounds is it possible legitimately to affirm its value over the alternative? Now, Polanyi's response is to point to a thrust toward knowing that seems to be a life force, that is to say, an assertion or exercise of will, a will to know and thereby live. This force at times achieves its goal, obviously. When it does succeed, it leaves a residue, a real one, thus overcoming the prospect of non-existence. In other words, meaning results from discovery of reality and truth. Even if there is a future total obliteration, this achievement did occur and remains real. These are things that Polanyi is telling us. But this raises a question. This is my question. How and why does this make a difference? After all, obliteration is obliteration. But Polanyi provides an answer to this question. Discovery of reality and truth makes a difference because of our commitment to the significance of discovering reality and truth. This is to say, so to speak, a deeper assertion that supports the assertion or exercise of will that I just mentioned is being made. This deeper assertion is what a person does, or at least what a person can do. The assertion of will qua affirmation of discovery of the real is the parallel in the intellectual creature man to what we see in all instances of life. And I suspect most of us in this session understand that since for Polanyi, discovery of reality and truth is dependent on commitment, what we have at the heart of Polanyi's theory of justification is commitment to commitment. So just to say this a little differently, I think Polanyi's answer to the existential challenge, to the crisis that he mentioned several times in here, the answer is commitment to commitment. And indeed, because of what man is capable of intellectually, we can understand and say that this establishment of meaning is what the universe as a whole is doing. And we're reminded of Personal Knowledge, chapter 13. It is possible to view it, the universe, as an evolutionary unfolding on a cosmic scale, where man is the vehicle for this movement to achieve awareness of reality and the significance of doing so. I have this image of my mind of each of us as human beings on the forward thrust of the evolutionary unfolding of the universe, and in each of us and in mankind generally, we are the vehicle for understanding and for the establishment of meaning. Discovery turns out to be the mechanism through which the universe gains meaning. So now I understand why discovery is so central to Polanyi, especially in this lecture. In individual, or what we might refer to as little discovery, we have the paradigmatic model for what I would call the big discovery, specifically of what the entire universe means, the big drama. Polanyi then is offering us a religion of discovery, the nature of which is very much clarified by Christianity, as we see in Personal Knowledge. At this point, Polanyi characterizes discovery as a transformation of self. This is pages 15 and 16, which is what we might refer to as the master game, or the point of the entire human enterprise. That is to say, the point of all this is for each of us to have a transformation in self, which consists of a discovery, an understanding. And it is here on page 12, it's here on pages 15 and 16 that the question of justification, which was prefigured on page 12, is explicitly raised. And it is now that we have the first substantive mention of commitment. There is also reference at this point to what he calls self-reliance. Now note the faith involved here. The probing mind that he talks about presupposes, that's his term, the probing mind presupposes the existence of an external reality on page 23 and the prospect of resulting meaning. We presuppose there is meaning. We presuppose there's external reality. This belief is the prerequisite for the groping for truth that defines our project. And since I'm reading Science, Faith, and Society for another project, I wanted to bring to your attention that all of this is talked about there in that addition to Science, Faith, and Society. That's the first chapter, or the first, you might call it the preface to the book. See page 17. Polanyi also recognizes the role played by hope when he states that we are, quote, sustained by a vision of reality, unquote. That's on page 23. And finally, recall page 25 of the lecture. This is really an important phrase. Quote, a choice of existence takes place in science, unquote. So this is Polanyi's response to the core existential challenge that we saw way back on page 12. And this, I think, is why he refers to Kierkegaard's either or. We have a choice. It's one way or the other. And a choice of existence takes place in science. And that's why we have all this discussion of science, I believe, in this lecture early on. So to sum this up, the personal dimension of science points to the resolution of the central questions facing man and mankind. Is there meaning to this existence? On what grounds can we justify saying that there is? I offer for your consideration that this is what is fundamentally being discussed in this third Duke lecture, and that Polanyi takes a roundabout path in arriving at this destination. My closing questions then are, first, why is that? Why the roundabout path? And second, recalling the startling final word of personal knowledge, why should we not be surprised that in the closing words of this lecture, Polanyi advises us to place man's duties above man? Well, that's what I have to say in the way of introduction. I hope I have provided ample gist for further discussion.
I was trying to find that quote on page 25 about the choice of existence in science. I'm not finding it. Is it?
Yeah, let me look.
It's at the bottom.
I didn't proofread my own numbers. Let's see. Yeah, down at the bottom, second line from the bottom.
Oh, okay. Yep, I see it now. Yep.
This is how a choice of existence takes place in science, as it does elsewhere too. I didn't put that in my comments, but it's not just science, right? This choice of existence occurs when you're a jurist. It occurs when you're an artist. It occurs when you're a Polanyi scholar, right? And it's the fundamental decision before us. And Polanyi, I think, focused on this matter.
John, there are times that he sort of generalizes that and speaks to the wider human condition and dilemmas, but there's this, it seems to me in this lecture, he is elevating particularly brilliant scientists to a sort of a superior plane. I mean, there's that one section where he talks about what most scientists do as soul deadening, or it kills,
that's right. Yeah,
kills your soul. So I find that interesting. His it's not just that he holds these great scientists in esteem. He's putting them on a different level as far as the universe becoming aware of itself.
right. And I think he'd say the same thing of the great religious leaders and the great artists and the great philosophers. I think all of them represent a human possibility that he is holding out for each of us. And it's through discovery that we establish meaning. And so these scientists, the greatest of the scientists, are paradigmatic in this regard.
Right.
I think that's correct. This is really about calling in some ways. And John, you've had a lot to say about calling. And he's particularly interested, of course, in the calling of science. But what goes on in this lecture is, in a certain sense, he's placing that against a certain kind of background that he finds, particularly in philosophy too, a background that I think he thinks is really, in some ways, quite perverse. I mean, you know, the Heidegger of Being and Time is talking about a lot of things that are similar to Polanyi with being in the world. But then there's the theme about being unto death. And of course, as you pointed out, John, what Polanyi wants to do is in a certain sense move beyond that stage. And he has the same sort of critique, despite his great appreciation of Husserl, or what he says is his great appreciation in his one-line praise. He thinks he's moved beyond, and he certainly thinks he's moved beyond Sartre. You know, there's in some ways a kind of stream of ideas in philosophy. It's no longer just the positivist anymore that he's arguing against, which certainly was the case, you know, early on, Science, Faith, and Society. The Marxists and the positivists are there in the background. And the positivists, of course, reappear in Duke 1. But now we've got a sort of broader intellectual stream that Polanyi is in some ways challenging, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree that he does not accept the gist of the existential position, but he finds a lot of wisdom there, I think.
I think he does find a lot of wisdom in Heidegger, especially in indwelling. And Husserl, I think he's right. I mean, people either building on Husserl or reacting against Husserl were important influences in the 20th century. Merleau-Ponty, Sartre, Derrida. And it's funny that he doesn't mention Merleau-Ponty in this. I admit, was he not familiar with him yet? Because later on he talks about how similar he and Merleau-Ponty are in this idea of embodiment and embodied knowing. And
we do know that he really reads Phenomenology of Perception after he leaves Duke, right after he reads Duke, because that's in the letters with Koch.
Mhm.
But I do think that some of these other thinkers, he may not know a lot about, to put it bluntly. I think he certainly read some Husserl. He writes Marjorie Green about Husserl. He writes Marjorie Green about Kant. You know, he's read some, at least secondary sources on existentialists, and particularly people like Heidegger. He's read the William Barrett book.
Barrett.
Yeah. So you know, there's some. And of course he's constantly in contact with Green, who's writing books about these people and articles about these people, and so he has some knowledge at least.
It seems like there are legitimate similarities that he's pointing out with Dasein, and there are differences. He doesn't have the thrownness into the world and that sort of thing, but it seems like there are also more similarities that he doesn't mention either. So maybe if he had read deeper, maybe didn't have time to talk about, like, language is the house of being, right? Or being is revealing itself to us, right? His idea that reality manifests itself to us seems similar to the lighting of being in Heidegger. But he is taming in Sartre and Nietzsche as far as creativity goes, trying to tie it to the real and not have it be just free form construction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Richard, do you want to say something?
Yes, on Merleau-Ponty, Magda told me that he wrote to Merleau-Ponty but never received a reply. I haven't checked this, but did Merleau-Ponty died in the meantime? I never checked that. It has occurred to me.
Well, I know he doesn't read much Merleau-Ponty until just after the Duke lectures. Now, Green has got him reading some other stuff a little before that, but I do think there are genuine similarities that he probably should have been more open to. But one of the criticisms Green has of him is she says he's very hesitant to see. similarities. Even though, she's often on his side in her criticism. I mean, she's very devastating on Heidegger and very devastating on Sartre, but of course she likes Merleau-Ponty.
If I may, in fact, at certain places, phenomenology of perception, I've noted, Merleau-Ponty almost formulates the form-to structure. Almost. It's there, but not
Talks
quite
about probes.
explicit. And in fact, interestingly, James Ward, the Cambridge philosopher and psychologist, wrote in the last page of his last book, which is of his second Gifford lectures, he did actually articulate that structure, though not in those terms. James Ward was a methodologist, and Bertrand Russell was interested in that topic. He did his thesis on it. But there's another one who actually got there long before Polanyi, but not quite.
Just one more comment on Merleau-Ponty. I think he's probably also read the Structure of Behavior. Is that the early one, Charlie? But about 10 years ago, Charlie gave a paper which suggested that Polanyi really hadn't read any of the late Merleau-Ponty. And I think that's correct.
Yeah, he worried that Merleau-Ponty was susceptible to reductionism, just like, and he considered Ryle to be susceptible to critics of reductionism, that the system that they have can unravel because he doesn't have this notion of universals that moves against nominalism, whereas universals can be real for Polanyi. And they were for Frege too. So he's in a tradition there of saying that in order for us to have knowledge, you have to believe that there are something like universals that are basically tools for knowing the world, through which we know the world.
Eric's got his hand up, I think.
Well, I saw Martin does too. I don't know.
Oh, sorry, I didn't say Martin.
You go first, Eric. Go for it.
You sure? Okay. Just to kind of build a little bit on the discussion between Charles and Phil and John's question of what's going on with some of the philosophical antecedents, I think that Polanyi is trying to deliberately kind of draw on some lines of research that some other researchers have and philosophers have been digging up, that there's maybe this kind of third way, this kind of building on the kind of the Neurath-Haller thesis, that there's kind of a uniquely Austrian, Hungarian perspective and philosophy that stands in contrast to German idealism. And so people like Barry Smith and stuff out of Buffalo have kind of mined this territory for a long time. And I think Polanyi's, I don't think he's quite as rich as maybe what Smith and other people have been doing in terms of his reading, as several of you have pointed out. But I think he's at least intuitively alluding and trying to reach out to that line and saying, hey, there are some predecessors here that are saying something similar. And of course, then he makes the grand statement of, well, now I've got it kind of right and I bring it to fruition. But I think he's appealing to that line. And a quick question I had about at the beginning of the essay, relative to some of the other points that John was making earlier in some of his questions, is Polanyi arguing that mathematics, the attempt of formalism in theoretical physics and elsewhere is always going to result in a deliberate flattening? So does Polanyi reject topology and some of the other movements within mathematics as a more dynamic way to get around the flattening? I don't know if I read Polanyi right there, and I just kind of wanted to throw that out.
I would say that there's a flattening, but the way he writes in this lecture especially is that once the problem is solved, basically we have an explicit understanding, the problem disappears. So as far as the explicit flattening things out, it might flattening things out, but it also brings across something that we want to adhere to as true or real. I think there is a flattening out, especially what John talks about when you move from particulars to a universal or a concept. But that's kind of an indication of the from-to structure too, where you have lots of different clues, different human beings, and then you have a joint comprehension that is a focus that can now be a lens through which you look back down at the particulars. So you see all these particulars as humans. But how it happens is part of the question that John raises. And back in Aristotle, he talks about this too. How do you get to, it's kind of a leading to, an induction to the revealing of something of mind, right? It's an epigoge to nous. And he talks about it as like a retreating army, where a retreating army, one person stops, then another, and before you know it, you have the resistance, the kind of critical mass to move forward again, to come back at the enemy. And it's kind of like this sort of slow building. And I think you get this with dynamic systems too, where you kind of get this different individuals kind of move towards some sort of attractor, create some sort of attractor, maybe like a hurricane or a funnel or something like that, where these individuals move around and then all of a sudden they could form a unity at some certain critical point. So I think the development of universals is kind of like that, but they all kind of tie together into a system.
So I'd like to just suggest something about the flattening. It seems to me that the key issue here is meaning for Polanyi. And meaning has to do, for him, as I read him, to do with anything that has purposes. And so I'm two answers here, one to Eric and one to John. I think mathematics is essentially for him a meaningless discipline. It is part of the structure of inductive thought, but it does not have purpose unless used for some purpose. Then it gains meaning, but by itself, it's flat, whether it's topology or whatever it is. So that would be the first comment. And then with respect to John's talking about perhaps Polanyi reaching for the meaning of the universe, I don't think that's part of his scheme. I think he's worried about humans experiencing meaning in some important way because we are discovering things. We have these purposes. We have this energy to do things that brings meaning into our lives. And I think when you look at things in terms of death, it seems like it's terminated. I would relate that kind of comment to its end at his last comments in the tacit dimension, that we need to have some sense through religion of that our meanings go beyond ourselves. But I don't think he is really ready to say the universe itself is meaningful. Meaning comes about first when you have living things that have separate purposes from the very structure of the universe, which is basically start off in terms of laws of physics and then chemistry. But meaning only arises once you start having life. At least that's the way I read him.
Yeah, but I would add that the universe issues in life.
That's true. It's an emergent. It's an emergent.
That's
but
right,
itself,
and that's how the universe gains its meaning, is through the yielding of those creatures through which meaning can be experienced. Now,
It might be
all-
whether there's multiple telic attractors or just one unifying telic attractor when you talk about the meaning of the universe versus meanings in the universe. That might be part of the difference there between a more religious view and a more pluralistic view.
Mhm.
I think Martin had his hand up.
Well, no, thank you first, John. Wonderful set of opening comments to get us going. And I don't know, as I've been waiting, more things accrue, so I'll try to limit it. But a quick question for later, maybe for Walt, is on the meaninglessness of math. It seems to me that there are a lot of comments throughout personal knowledge where he talks about math in the same terms he would talk about art, insofar as he talks about mathematicians pursuing sort of this
Harmony.
abstract formulation, which is beautiful in its consistency, et cetera, et cetera. And so it seems to me that that might be a form of meaning. But what I really wanted to jump in on quickly, hopefully, is combining, hopefully with some degree of coherence, maybe three of the threads we were talking about, so that the existential force of the arguments that he's making here, combined with the idea that John distilled for us, which is that discovery is the process by which we come into the meanings, right? You know, and then John, you mentioned he kind of advocates a religion of discovery. And I think that discovery and meaning relationship is important and interesting. And I think it's a parallel to the universal particular relationship. And the reason why I say that is because Polanyi, I feel like oftentimes fishes out of both sides of the stream and is very vague about whether a meaning is discovered, was it already there and we came upon it, which is ultimately what I take him to be mostly saying, though I would agree with Phil that it's a participated process, so it's not strictly one side or the other, right? But it's kind of messy. Maybe that leads to his messy language. Or did we just create it, right? And so similarly, I mean, Charlie, you were talking about epagoge leading to nous, right? But of course, in Aristotle, but of course, there's another backside to that, which is that it, in a certain sense, in Aristotle, epagoge comes from nous, in some sense, from the prime mover being the formal cause of all. Now, there are all kinds of debates about, right, is the prime mover also an efficient cause, like Plato's good would be, or not? But as some of you guys know, and some of you guys were kind enough to give me lots of comments on, in November, I presented a paper, and I'm trying to get into this, which I'm still developing, about this messiness, right? So I know Polanyi himself places himself in the inductive Aristotelian tradition explicitly, in terms of the debate over universals. But still, if you look at that last section of posterior analytics, where Aristotle, that is, talks about the formation of the universal in with a metaphor, a military metaphor, that like suddenly a soldier stands up, and that's when the universal kind of is implanted in the mind of the knower. I think, following a lot of other kind of Aristotelian scholars, I think there's a lacuna there in his theory, in Aristotle's theory. And I think, therefore, in Polanyi's theory too, except that since Polanyi is not as obsessed with being as overwhelmingly explicit as Aristotle is, I think Polanyi's vaguer language gives him more outs. So just to wrap this up, I mean, the example that I'm probing as a counterexample to that purely inductive type of relationship with universals is, how were the men, Charlie, you used kind of like, how do we see different people, right? And then the joint meaning of this, right? We look through it, the new comprehensive entity is the universal, but how were those recognized in the first place? And in the Phaedo, Plato talks about, there are the two sticks of equal length. And so how did you come to understand the concept of equality? Well, you saw equal things, except you recognized them as equal. So how did you recognize them as equal in the first place when you didn't have, right? And there comes anamnesis, right? You're recollecting it, and so on and so forth. So anyway, I just wanted to throw some of that out and hear what you guys have to say. And also, I wasn't able to attend last week, but your discussion of comprehensive entities was really wonderful.
Yeah, it was.
Anyway, thank you for listening. I shall shut up.
Well, let me just give a quick response to your first thing. You have much richer thing to say, but in terms of mathematics, yes, it's a tool, but I see mathematics as very much like as in the kind of abstract ideal of reasoning. But for him, I think the meaning comes in the connection with reality itself. It as an abstraction, it isn't quite the same as the reality itself, I think, in his view. It's more like a kind of a positive, like positivism. You can apply the laws of physics, you can apply the laws of chemistry, but in themselves, it's only in the application that they're meaningful, but they're flat in the sense that they're not carrying meaning itself. So that's kind of the way I try to respond to what you're saying, Martin.
Yeah, following up on that a little bit. Speaking of the Austrians, Frege and Germans, he also criticized the formalists too, because he said there's no meaning to any of these mathematics or logic, even if you're just looking at the relations between the symbols. And he also talked about sense or sin, which kind of is like particulars leading to a meaning for a word. So there's the sin or sense of a word, and then there was the Bedeutung, the actual referent, if it connected to a thing in the real world. I think of sort of mathematics and like grammar and logic as emergent structures, and they're abstract as Walt says, because it kind of, they can relate to each other in ways that can bracket out the meanings, right? So you have concepts relating to each other in ways that you might even bracket out the individuals. You have math where you can work with the numbers and what you're counting doesn't make a difference anymore. And it reminds me of kind of the connectionists sort of approach, like clues to joint focus. You have clues to meanings, but then you can have an emergent structure on that. So you can have, I think this was mentioned, was it last week or the week before? We need a logic of things, not sentences. I think there is a logic of things. That's the idea of sin or sense. And then you get the logic of sentences building on the logic of things. It's kind of an emergent structure. And although we think of it as a one-to-one relationship between sentences, it's built on more. So we think of it, you know, snow is white only if and only if snow is white. We think of sentences attaching to a fact and a one-to-one relation, but what snow is, what white is, how they relate to each other in grammar, all that is based on many-to-one sorts of relations rather than a one-to-one, and it's a kind of an emergent structure. So as far as formalism goes, I can think of it as something that's emergent that has its own different meaning, right? Because it can bracket out the individual meanings, and then it can form its own meaning, its own harmonies, and it have its own beauty, even though it's built on more particular things. The idea of epigoge to nous, and that nous and some sort of prime mover is active in helping us move towards discovery. I think that's the prime mover for Aristotle, I believe, was telic. It was drawing us forward, right? Drawing us forward with love or with some sort of motion. He also acknowledged efficient causes too, right? Efficient material causes as well as telic and formal. So I think he'd probably agree in the end with someone like Leibniz, who said that there's going to be a harmony between the telic and the efficient, right? They're all coordinating. So it's almost like you can look at a trajectory one way and think of everything as you're moving through history as efficient causes. And from the end, you can say, oh, look at all those things led up to this. And so they coordinate that way. But there is also the problem of when a particular, so I don't think you do identify individuals as men or as a cow or as something, some concept, a universal, before you get to the universal. It's tacit. You kind of see patterns and similarities, right? So it's kind of a pattern recognition thing until the pattern manifests as a joint meaning. And then you can look back and say, oh, that black and white thing on the hill, that was a cow, right? Before it was just, maybe you had the concept of animal moving around, right? Now once you develop, you discover the concept of cow, you say, that's a cow, and this is a cow, and that's a cow, and you can start trying to subsume things under that concept. Yeah, and actually this idea of the subsumption of individuals under a concept is the key logical relation for Frege. So it connects back in with that.
I'd like to comment just one bit further on this flatness motif, which appears, of course, at the beginning of the discussion in this lecture as he's talking about mathematics and the limits of formalism. But flatness appears a little bit later, too. Remember that Husserl is supposedly the most influential philosopher of the 20th century, but Polanyi sort of introduces that notion by suggesting that there's a certain sense in which Husserl had an intuition about something of the hierarchical universe of the medieval period. However, Husserl, according to Polanyi, falls flat on his face. Now, whether he's got that right or not, but it's this hierarchical universe that Polanyi is interested in, and that, of course, the next two lectures are going to dwell on as we talk about emergence and some other things. All of this is in some ways a sort of attempt to move beyond a kind of a one-level universe, it seems to me. And the whole problem of meaning is deeply integrated with the need to rediscover a way to understand things in terms of a hierarchy.
And that's what Marjorie didn't like about Polanyi and preferred with Merleau-Ponty, that his issued in more of a pluralism than a hierarchy as far as the way the universe builds up.
I have a thought about hierarchical universe and the structured universe. Forgive me, I'm finding the words for it right now, but it seems like there's a good point of contrast here between Polanyi's hierarchical universe and the flat universe of the semioticians, of certain vein of semioticians that Wittgenstein finds his way out of eventually, but the language, the flatness of language, and I would expect that the asymmetric from to relationship of dwelling in and looking through that asymmetry provides the basis for a non-flat world. The fact that we can always dwell in something and see a joint meaning, a joint entity that is of a different nature than the particulars, I think provides the basis for something different.
I think that's where he connects the tacit structure with emergence too. So you have a non-flat universe, you have emergent structures and he connects them very tightly, the idea of the asymmetry that you point out between the particulars, knowing the particulars, and then knowing something new and different through them. And the similarity, the analogy is between the parts and the wholes, and needing to dwell on the parts to understand the whole.
Can I try to connect what Rain and Charlie just said and circle back really briefly to the universals, because I just wanted to clarify one thing, that the position I'm exploring, kind of trying to combine to a certain extent Plato and Polanyi, would actually have a hierarchical view of universals. So the example we were using earlier, Charlie was using, were cows or people, right? And the universal. And there's a sense in which I wouldn't argue necessarily that there is, a Platonic form of the human necessarily, or of the bovine, but for us to even have the powers to recognize the spots on a hill, as you like to mention, Charlie, a lot of times when we're discussing this, there have to be some kind of pre-existent universals that we're tacitly aware of, like boundary and form, so that we can mark off that, oh, that's a black dot on the green background.
Yeah.
Or prior to even saying green, that's just, that's that and that's that. And that other that is similar. So we have to have tacit access, anamnetic access to these kinds of things. But then I would say that's what I would call a primordial form, something like equality, difference, sameness, boundary, a lot of things that Polanyi uses when he talks about boundary conditions and so on and so forth. But then I think you can then have a hierarchical structure. And if you want to call it emergent, you can say that you can have the universal bovine emerges from this prior set of primordial forms. But I don't think you can emerge a whole new logical category of existence. And that's where I think I agree with John that in Thomas Nagel's sense, Polanyi's view is that emergence is reductive, right? I.e. that in some sense, the raw materials are all there and then they develop in novel and unpredictable ways. But yeah, so that's all. Thank you.
That makes sense that there is some forms, some universals that are more fundamental that others partake in. And then there's the difference between, and maybe, I don't know if they'd be equivalent or a different category than the ones you mentioned, like equality and shape and things like that. But the ability to recognize patterns would definitely precede the recognition of the universals I mentioned. But then there are things that, like they call the transcendental ideas, or beauty, truth, justice, these sorts of things. And they relations between the particulars and a joint meaning, or are they themselves a joint meaning, or both? Because the harmony between the evidence and the theory, right, in yourself, you and the person that recognizes things as evidence towards a theory, it seems to be in the harmony of that where you get the experience of beauty. So Polanyi, I think of this essay, talks about higher forms of beauty, and I'm wondering, should he be saying higher forms of beauty, or should he be saying forms of beauty based on different levels of clues or sorts of clues that come together, right, for the mind, as opposed for more sensory kind of unities and harmonies. So I'm wondering what you think, Martin, about those transcendentals. Do you think that they are basic, a part of the sort of structure or process, or are they at the end, right, as far as drawing us forward towards justice, towards beauty, or some combination of those?
Yeah, I mean, briefly, I'm on a journey, so what do I know? But as a sort of some sort of a Platonist, I'd say it's both of those. It's at the beginning and the end. But yeah, it seems to me that, kind of, I've been doing some reading on the good in Plato compared with the prime mover in Aristotle, and I think that there is something about that kind of I think there's something very Neoplatonist in the section that John was mentioning about the unfolding of the universe, right? I mean, it's very easy to read the end of personal knowledge and think about something like a Neoplatonist world soul at work, for example. I'm not advocating that, but that idea of kind of the self-giving generation of everything coming out of the good seems very to harmonize nicely with what Polanyi is. So I personally would definitely affirm the transcendentals, and it seems to me that Polanyi does too, though I know Walt has a different take on the transcendentals.
Well, here's what I'd say briefly, that the discussion you're talking about, we start off with animal kind of recognition through our perception of the world. It's quite detailed. What makes a difference is language. And once you have language, you have the possibility of comparing things and getting higher level patterns than perceptual patterns. So that's where your transcendentals come in. Not until you've really developed language does it make much sense to talk about these higher level abstractions. But animals are certainly very knowledgeable about the world in terms of perceptual patterns.
I'd add that although some of the higher level concepts don't come until you have language, that there might be some kind of pre-beauty, pre-forms, like preconceptual sorts of instances, because animals do respond to beauty, right? You've seen
Yes,
the mating, and one of the theories is that in the symmetry and the beauty that they see and recognize in a potential mate, that is a clue towards physical health, right? So there's more symmetry in an animal that is healthier, or there's, the birds of paradise show their wings and colors. They're showing that they don't have any parasites or anything like that, right? So beauty as a kind of a joint comprehensive feeling that comes with information about the health of an individual in a species, which means that the transcendental beauty is already there in some form when we're talking about animals relating to each other and not just humans relating to what we see as beautiful.
I totally agree.
I'd like to, while we're on this beauty business, I'd like to point out that for the third straight lecture, Einstein reappears. And he, of course, is intimately connected with several things, including beauty. This is a couple of sentences on page 15. Relativity not only changed our interpretive framework, but also contributed to a shift in our standards of intellectual valuation towards an appreciation of more abstractly mathematical harmonies. Discovery must therefore have been striving toward new kinds of intellectual beauty, more satisfying to our transformed intellectual selves. Now, in those 2 or 3 sentences, he gets in about 4 things: a new intellectual framework, new standards of intellectual value, new kinds of intellectual beauty, and this business that John pointed us to at the beginning, the sort of existential element of scientific discovery, which is the transformation of the discoverer.
Mr. Ludlow's had his hand up for a while.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, just a couple points. I just wonder, like I'm reading Bonaventure and Aquinas, and the transcendentals just are what being is. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So when you talk about the being of anything, a concept or a tree, they just have truth, beauty, and goodness, in them. And I just wonder if we get some of those things when we talk about, these big, large, and broad universals developmentally when we're children. I've been around a bunch of kids under the age of 6, and pre-verbally, before they're 18 months old, they're already absorbing the universe. They're tacitly and intuitively absorbing things and developing all kinds of knowledge. And so they're developing a sense of causality, beauty, goodness, even justice. You're around a 2-year-old. 2-year-olds know all about justice. And so there's a developmental thing going on. And I'm wondering if that also explains some of the problems with formalism, because it seems Polanyi and a lot of the phenomenologists want to focus more on the knower than on knowledge. We talk about knowledge, but as soon as we talk about knowledge apart from a knower, we start missing the boat. So we should first always say that we're knowers. And those are just a couple comments. And I'm reading a book called Being Given by Jean-Luc Marion, and he had some interesting things to say about math and flattening. I mean, Marion's thesis is there's something which Polanyi would be in great agreement with, called saturated phenomena. He says when we're in the world, we're experiencing all phenomena, and there's phenomena that's not saturated, and then there's phenomena that just overwhelms us with its intuitive properties. The less we can conceptualize it, the more saturated it is. And there's something appealing about that. And he goes on in the part, he says, the more abstract, the more certainty, the more objectification, the less it's phenomenal. And he then classifies that as mathematics and abstraction. So he has an interesting way of what we described earlier as this flattening. Math is flat because it's abstract, certain, and objectified. So anyway, those are a few thoughts to throw in.
I'd like to link back to some things that actually go back way back to almost the beginning of John's introduction to socialism. And but it also
Dale, we're having trouble hearing. There you go. Get the mic closer to.
I'll try to hear me now.
That's better.
Okay. I'm sorry for the difficulty. I'd like to pick up on what is it that attracts Polanyi to certain of these existentialists mentioned in the lecture, and both what they have in common, and then also what he doesn't find interesting about them at all. And it's not really brought out by Polanyi's own comments. At least you have to read between the lines even then to come up with much. But I think a whole lot of Polanyi's reluctance to get closer, or to be closer in the public's eye to Sartre, or Kierkegaard, or Heidegger, is the nihilistic element in their thought, and he doesn't bring out, when he discusses them, why they are so problematic for him. And it would have been good if he could have, because the readers will understand better why he doesn't want to go there. But he clearly has something in common in stressing the existential decision-making and resolutions by the knower as in seeking self-transformation as he pursues understanding and truth, as the knower does. And so where, for example, Sartre really gets off track as far as Polanyi is concerned, is that at basically a kind of phenomenological level of description, Sartre's understanding of experience gets resolved in a way, the way he sorts it out, in a way that doesn't really allow for the way in which the intimations of a dawning discovery draw us forward in a positive way. For Sartre, as well as for a number of these other existentialists, I want to make exception of Kierkegaard. I think Kierkegaard is just way misunderstood by all sorts of folks. But where it gets off track, where that is, Sartre gets off track, is that he has no role for what theologians would call grace. There's no way in which the movement beyond uncertainty to decision and resolution, that it's as if leaping off a cliff and there's no clues whatsoever as to where you're heading. Polanyi wants to say there are clues all the time. but we can't pin them down explicitly. And it seems to me that that's one of the key elements of where Polanyi's existentialism differs from persons like Sartre, Nietzsche, and Heidegger too, for that matter.
Yeah, I think Sartre and Nietzsche would not see themselves as nihilists, but looking at them and hoping for a better sense of reality and more criteria for discovering it, we'd see them as nihilists in the end.
Yeah, that's a fair qualification.
I'm recalling something in one of the letters, Phil, I don't know if you remember this, but Polanyi sort of expressing almost envy about the passion in existentialism and how, and talking with Marjorie about how he can get that into his system. And I see that, I mean, that's what he's trying to do here with the great scientists. He's trying to make them sort of an existentialist hero, it seems to me, in those closing pages of this lecture. Do you remember anything about that, Phil?
I remember the letter, and you're exactly right. He saw much of the sort of literature of existentialism as rather jazzy, as whereas he was doing epistemology, or primarily doing epistemology, and he thought that was a little staid. And he was asking her how to get, as you say, and I think this lecture may be the answer to that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for being late for this meeting, but I want to comment on that about the survey of all possible solutions to a problem as being insufferably dull. And I think that this has to do something with, there's a dialectic there, because you can't know the state of a question without doing some sort of survey of the possible answers that have been given. And yet at the same time, if that's carried on too long, way it gets really dull. And I think that Polanyi was struggling with his felt need to try to survey famous philosophers and see similarities and contrasts with his position and explicate his position that way, and the passion with which he wanted to communicate really novel and creative perspective on science and knowing that he had.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That's another section I wanted us to talk about, and we have not talked about that. It's like he's really very condescending toward a lot of scientists, and a lot of the way and I'm not sure that they find it that dull. In fact, I was thinking about the worldwide passionate search for a vaccine right now is not going to lead. It's not necessary to have a discovery in the sense he's talking about discoveries in this, it seems to me. Sorry. Did others puzzle about that? And he's, it's almost like all of normal science, to use Kuhnian categories, all of the mopping up, that's not important the way he talks about it in these closing pages of this lecture. Just the big discoveries.
Yeah. I happen to interpret dullness as lack of importance more than a personal feeling of the scientists. He's pointing out that if science is conducted in this formalized way, as if you have to or even can survey all the possibilities, as if when science doesn't rely on beauty and intuition, then that's when it becomes dull.
Okay.
and he's critical of scientists who do the dull version of science and defend that as what is most objectively true and valid.
Charlie?
Yeah, back to this idea of trying to jazz things up by heroizing specific scientists and talking about genius and that sort of thing. I think that can be misleading too. I think that especially with this understanding of tacit knowledge, right? If someone's immersed in the facts, immersed in the fields, of course they're going to have a better intuition, a better grasp of how these ideas go together and how they relate and how it connects to reality. It's not like there are just a few people who have special gifts for doing that. I think we all do. And it's just that they take we all have this genius and they take their genius, immerse themselves in the field, try to understand the problems and successfully come up with a solution. So I think it's, again, and it's sociological too, he'll recognize that different people in different countries come up with the same genius idea because the ground is set for that idea to come up, right? There's enough of the basic research done in different areas where it can come together into a discovery. So I think it's misleading and to just stress genius and Einstein and Broglie and as if they're might jazz things up, but I think it's also alienating for the rest of us.
Right. And a passage that relates to that, I think, is on page 24, where he distinguishes between tacit knowing and personal knowledge rather strongly. And he says, I've described tacit knowing as the less intensely personal form of indwelling, most striking feature which lay in its unspecifiability. By passing on to scientific inquiry and to discoveries of great originality, we meet with a more dynamic knowing to which the distinctive powers of the knower make a decisive contribution. Here the term personal knowledge becomes more appropriate. Does he really want to do that?
Yeah.
It seems to me that the science that he more frequently endorses and respects is precisely the science which requires greater amounts of faith and commitment. And so he holds Einstein and others so high because of the personal qualities required for them to do what they did. Doesn't mean the other people aren't doing anything of any value, but they're doing something that requires less of that which he respects.
Eric?
Yeah, thanks. Well, to kind of build on Gus's question and then Rain's response and Charles's response, I was reading this as Polanyi not so much elevating the scientists as just using them as several others have commented as the paradigmic examples, right, of what he has argued is the highest manifestation of human thought. So it's not so much that, hey, we have to lionize Einstein as much as here's something everybody can identify with, understands Einstein. Here's a beautiful example of what I'm talking about. And he closes, to Gus's question earlier, he closes the essay on page 27 with, I think, a really powerful statement. That last paragraph and the last couple sentences, I think this gets a little bit maybe to what Rain was Rain was maybe alluding to, is I read Polanyi just saying, look, I'm fighting against the reductionism and this false rhetoric, right? That the scientific prejudice is out there, because he says, hey, look, he goes, the current ideals of science are false and misleading. These ideals were invented and benefit the physicists, right, who flourish by disregarding them, right? So he's saying, yeah, this is all rhetoric that's out there. This is not actually what they do, right? I guess to kind of go back to some of the Kuhnian stuff too, but this is just false rhetoric that needs to be displaced. So not that normal science is somehow inferior to what Polanyi was advocating, but he's saying that these practitioners aren't even doing what they're preaching, right? This is all just philosophical rhetoric that is wrong-headed. But
there is that point. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate the last couple comments. Thank you, Eric. And for me, that what you said brings out the conflict between exemplifying and holding up these paragons with Polanyi's agenda, which is to naturalize discovery, to naturalize genius, and that process of making that leap. So I think they're probably mutually enforcing in terms of trying to universalize these things that are exemplified in these moments that transcend all existing formal knowledge.
One of the things that there's a whole lot in here about problems and the vectoral aspect of tacit knowing and pursuing problems. Some of this is another Polanyi stuff also. But there's some threads that about reality and truth that I think are very important, and these were also very central to the other two lectures preceding. I don't think Polanyi ever wants to let go of the notion of contact with reality and the notion of truth. Those seem to me to be absolutely central to what he's up to.
Go ahead, Stan.
Stan, you need to unmute yourself. Stan, you're muted.
There we go.
I like to go back a little bit to this existentialist theme we've been talking about, response to something Dale said a little while ago, that Polanyi was suspicious about how far you could go with Sartre because there's nothing like a concept of grace in Sartre, and yet this essay that we read for today about commitment, and I agree that it's kind of strange that the word commitment doesn't come in until page 20, but in any case, that strikes me as a theme that was very fundamental to Sartre. That, you know, I mean, here's a guy that committed himself to the resistance in France, and, you know, could have been captured at any time and tortured and whatnot. So, but commitment and solidarity to the whole of his people was huge for him as an existential commitment. So I think there is it's not a transcendental for Sartre, but it's within the human existential realm. It is his equivalent anyway, that solidarity with others in a cause of resisting, you know, violence and evil and torture and all that. The comments about Heidegger that have come up today reminded me of a conference I was at on the Society for the Advancement of American Philosophy, and there was a keynote speaker, and somebody in the audience mentioned Heidegger, and he said, he asked if the speaker would comment about the fact that Heidegger felt that philosophy had nowhere else to go, that you could not go any further with philosophy as he knew it. And so Heidegger, and, you know, the late Heidegger in a sense turns toward poetry. And because he feels that philosophy has come to a dead end. And the speaker, the keynote speaker that day said, you know, it's too bad that Heidegger didn't know Dewey, because if he had read Dewey, he would have known, and I don't really know whether Heidegger read Dewey or not, but in any case, the comment was, if he had known Dewey sufficiently, he would have known that there's always a next step. The next step is always inquiry. There's always a next inquiry to be made. And it occurs to me today that very much the same is true about particularly in the context of all this discussion about meaning, and meaning, on a large scale, kind of rumbling around in the background, at least, of Polanyi's thinking, that in any case, whether or not there's a meaning to the universe as a whole, what Polanyi is doing is something like what I just said about Dewey, that there's always a next step. There's always a new inquiry to be made. There's always a new look at all the phenomena for clues to something else, to some other coherence in nature or in human society or in human or the inner life of the human being too, for that matter. There's one statement that occurs on page 1 of today's lecture that struck me very strongly along these lines, and that is, to be meaningful. This is the very first paragraph of the lecture. To be meaningful, a statement must be substantially indeterminate. And that strikes me as it's sort of in my mind, I come, essentially from the field of literature myself, and I've been a long-term student of poetry, but it strikes me as a point of intersection with the poetic attitude toward language. There's always something indeterminate about poetic language. That's something that is beyond the scope of what, for example, a logical positivist attitude toward language is. Language is or should be determinate. To the extent that it's not determinate, cast it into the flames, as Hume said. But if it's indeterminate, then that means there's more to be discovered. And take what any one of us has been saying here today. There's more to be thought or said about it, and that's part of the fruitfulness of human thinking and of tacit knowing or tacit thinking, if I can put it that way, that there's always something embedded in words and in syntax that is not being formally explicit, being made formally explicit, and yet could be the seeds of new inquiry and new discovery on the part of the thinker himself or on the part of any of the listeners, any of us listening to each other here today. It puts me in mind also of Heidegger's wonderful distinction between calculative thinking and meditative thinking. That what tacit knowing is, in a way, now this is a broad statement, but some of you have been studying Polanyi for a lot longer than I have, and so on. But it could be that tacit knowing is really the epistemology that explains what happens in meditative thinking. And it's no surprise to me that Polanyi, in many places in PK and other texts, uses the word contemplation, which is a monastic religious term that he's importing into philosophy. It's a philosophical term too, but he tends to use it in a way that kind of coordinates with this idea of religious or spiritual meditation, or contemplative states that are common to mystics and this sort of thing. So I'll stop. Thank you very much. Enjoyed this conversation today very much. Thank you all for being here.
Have we reached an end, Gus?
I say Charlie's got his hand up. Maybe he's got the last word.
Well, I was just thinking about one of John's early questions about what the criteria for valid knowledge is, right? And I think it's got to be more than just consistency. I think it's the rootedness in indwelling and knowing too, that that gives us a sense of rightness. So consistency, beauty might be one of the indications too, but the coherence of the evidence has to be rooted in some sort of ground, maybe not a one-to-one ground, but a many-to-one ground. And the criteria might change, as he points out, right? He's trying to stretch the idea of valid knowledge from a narrow view of science modeled on physics to a view of valid knowledge that extends out through the softer science and the humanities, and right, all kinds of knowledge can now have the same sort of validity that that science has. And it isn't here, and I don't know, it's in PK, but he talks about the difference between, and maybe it's coming up later, validation and verification. And he's going to acknowledge that there are ways of verifying in science too, if you're going to, right, as he says, your intuition, your discovery, that may all be wrong, right? To think that intuition is always right is a mistake, because it's built up on your experience and your attempt to get coherences that are unveiled to you based on the clues that you've absorbed. And how do we know that your discovery is wrong? Well, there are other criteria for verification that get applied later on in science, but it builds up. I think he's like Aristotle, where according to Aristotle, different sciences have different criteria for validity, right? And you wouldn't expect the same sort of criteria for validity in psychology as you would in physics, as you would in mathematics.
I think Richard had his hand up, and so does Richard Moody. Richard Allen, would you?
Yes, very, very quickly. When you're talking about existentialism, you think only of the black school, which is Sartre, Heidegger, and others, not of the person who invented the term, namely Gabriel Marcel, who, against the despair of these others and the irrational commitment, as in with Heidegger, you've got to be resolute, but what? As some of his pupils said, I'm resolute, but I don't know what I'm resolved about. Heidegger, Gabriel Marcel, the philosopher of hope, faith, and charity. And it's very different. He finds a fundamental natural hope in people, which sustains people in life. You know, otherwise, why don't we all commit suicide? Gabriel Marcel said that suicide is the great question for philosophy. And so, sorry, I lost my thread. Apologize. And surely that is the way that Polanyi ought to go. That there is a real meaning in the universe which necessarily transcends it. He won't take that path, which is very clear in what he says about evolution. And it's very clear that Heidegger and is the opposite. That German thought is usually a matter of either pure reason as with Kant or blind faith as with the earlier Heidegger. Later on, Heidegger is very different. In Heidegger, man is now the shepherd of being, not the isolated. And there's no unity, there's no we in Sartre, you remember. There's only the anonymous you or we of the exit sign. You know, we can only objectify other people. There's no indwelling of them, there's only staring at them. The attitude of the voyeur, if you remember, being and nothing. So I would suggest that we ought to look at Polanyi more from the positive, hopeful philosophy of Gabriel Marcel, who was very cautious in his theistic claims, but nevertheless saw the way beyond. But unfortunately, Polanyi was still stuck with too much of the Enlightenment, I think. And some of those people who talk about Enlightenment values. Now, for one thing, the Enlightenment dismissed history. And,
Richard
Richard
Moody.
That's it.
Yes, just in passing, I want to kind of endorse what Richard Allen has just said. I've always seen Marcel and Polanyi as very complementary to one another in terms of their emphasis upon hope. The main thing that I wanted to talk about was that notion of every statement to have meaning must be indeterminate. And I think that's deeply tied up with his denial of the possibility of fully explicit knowledge. And I thought that, you know, one of the things that came out in an earlier essay was the importance of images for Polanyi's thinking. And it seems to me that a powerful image that he introduces in this lecture is the image of being able to put up a fully mathematical theory of the universe on a blackboard, and how this is just one-dimensional. And yet every bit of data and formula that's in there requires an act of understanding on the part of a person, which necessarily draws upon the tacit dimension to give it meaning. We could talk about this for such a long time, but I'll stop there.
Talk about flattening.
Well, we are at the end of our time. Shall we quit?
Our time is flattened out.
Our time
It just gets better and better.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. More next week.
Thank you, Gus.
Yes, Charlie
Phil
is.
and everyone.
Charlie is the facilitator next week.
Great.
That's what I can do. All right.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks,
Goodbye,
John.
everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Indeed.
Have a great weekend.
Thanks, John.
You're welcome.